Welcome, everyone. We'll just take one more minute to allow a few more people to arrive, and then we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. I can see a few more people are arriving, but we'll get started as we have a lot of interesting material to cover today. Welcome to today's piloting clinic for the TNFD. For those of you who are new to the TNFD forum or to our piloting clinics, these are organized on a monthly basis for forum members. They complement our monthly forum webinars. And these piloting clinics are focused on the experiences of real organizations who are piloting the beta version of the TNFD framework. So very grateful to the pilot testers here today. It's extremely useful for the task force and for the Secretariat team to learn insights directly from those who are piloting the framework. And we hope it's also useful for all of you as organizations which might be piloting yourselves or interested in piloting. So these are really practice-oriented sessions. We'll be diving more deeply into the details of the framework and its application. And that's following one of our principles for TNFD to make sure that what we are producing in the framework is usable for the market and valuable for market participants. So looking forward to hearing lessons and frustrations and challenges and solutions from our guest speakers today, Yoko, Okonogi from Kirin, and Stephanie Hime from Little Blue Research. So thanks in advance for joining us today and for all of the forum members who are joining us also. I look forward to your comments and questions later today. So this is our agenda for today. We will be hearing a little bit from our Secretariat team member, Laura Clavey, who leads support to the Task Force on Metrics and Targets on the assess phase of the LEAP approach, which is what we're diving into, is assessing risks and opportunities, building on what's done in the locate and evaluate phase of LEAP. Then we'll hear two examples from pilot tests from Stephanie and from Yoko. Building from their experience, we'll move into a Q&A for any comments, questions, and discussion that it prompts. So let me move to the next, just a few housekeeping points. We will be recording the session, and we usually send out the recording in our Forum Insights newsletter and make it available on YouTube. So that was the intention that this will be shared afterwards. There are some tips here for how to get the best experience via Zoom using Speaker View. And please do use the Q&A function, as we always do, to add questions and to like what others have put up, so we see what's most important and popular for us to cover in the discussion. So very briefly to introduce our speakers today. Yoko Okonogi is from Kirin Holdings, a beverage company in Japan. She has, as part of the Creating Shared Value Strategy department, and has worked on environmental management and environmental impact assessment. So welcome, Yoko. Also welcoming Dr. Stephanie Hime, who's the Managing Director of Little Blue Research, which is involved in a number of related areas to TNFD, including the Capitals Coalition, the ISSB and the BSI, the British Standards Institute, as well as several others, and is involved in supporting a company she'll be talking about with pilot testing. And finally, Laura Clavey, who has part of the Secretariat team leading the support to metrics and targets. So welcome to all three of you. So just to give us a bit of a deep dive before we go into the experiences of the pilot testers, Laura, could you just give us a bit of a deeper look into the assess phase of the LEAP approach in the draft framework?
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, so this is just going to be a really quick 5-minute overview of the assess phase within the LEAP approach. Go to the next slide. So just a reminder of what the LEAP approach looks like. Hopefully it's vaguely familiar to everyone already. It has 4 pillars of stages. So the first stage is the assess, is the locate phase, so it's locating your interface with nature. The second is the evaluating, so understanding your dependencies and impacts. And it's the assess phase, which is the focus of this session, which is the material risks and opportunities and understanding the extent and the magnitude of them to your organisation. And then finally preparing to respond and report. So though it's a large process, we're just going to be focusing on the third pillar, which is the assess one today. So the first part of the assess phase is understanding what your risks and opportunities are for your organisation and doing the initial stages of identifying them. So TNFD provides some key terms and definitions around the language of risks and opportunities to try to create harmonisation of how different organisations are identifying their risks and opportunities. So nature-related risks are defined as potential threats to an organisation linked to its dependencies and wider society's dependencies on nature and nature impacts. And these can derive from physical, transition and systemic risks. So we've identified different categories. Physical is again split into acute and chronic, as with climate, and transition is split into policy and legal, market, technology and reputation. In terms of systemic risk, we outline the importance of it and its interconnections to other risk types, but we don't currently provide metrics on systemic risks itself. Then the definition of nature-related opportunities are activities that create positive outcomes for organisations and nature by creating positive impacts on nature or mitigating negative impacts. And again, we outline different categories, which is slightly different from TCFDs. We go one step further than TCFD. We split these into business performance opportunities, which include markets, capital flow and financing, products and services, resource efficiency and reputational capital, and sustainability performance, which we split into the sustainable use of natural resources, ecosystem protection, restoration and regeneration. And these categories can help organisations to understand what risks could be relevant for them and how it could fit into their activities. So this is a figure that was included in our version 0.2 release, and the purpose of it is to show how the risks connect to the rest of the business process, so how they're generated to begin with and how it eventually ends up in risks and opportunities. So business risks and opportunities are generated by impact drivers, which can be caused by organisations themselves, but also external drivers of change. And they can be connected to either impacts on nature, which create risks and opportunities in themselves, or business dependencies on nature. So the impact drivers and the external drivers of change will create change in the state of nature, which affects the underlying ecosystem assets that organisations rely on to provide ecosystem services. So that would be changes to the ecosystems themselves. And this then affects the supply of services that come out of the ecosystems. So that could be changes to the quality of the air, the quality of the water provision, the number, the distribution of species there. And due to the dependencies of organisations or the impacts created by organisations, this can then generate risks and opportunities to them in terms of fines or reputational damage or changes to the underlying assets they rely on. I won't go through this slide in detail, but it's just to note that there's different types of financial implications that organisations can experience. So the different categories we outline are credit risk, market risk, liquidity risk, operational risk, liability risk, and reputational risk. We have different definitions of these and examples that were included in our version 0.3 release and also available on the website for further information. So that was the first step, so A1. So once an organisation has identified their different risks and opportunities, they then move on to identifying the specific risk mitigation and risk and opportunity management processes and elements that may be needed to be adjusted to integrate nature-related risks and opportunities. And this is following the same language that TCFD uses as well to create market harmonization. I've included a few of our principles that we have for doing this, which are again based on TCFD, but adapted particularly to include location-based principle due to the importance of different places for nature-related risk. So we guide that when organisations are considering nature-related risks and opportunities and adapting their internal processes, they should consider how this can be location-based. So consider where the risk is taking place, consider the interconnections between different types of risks, consider the time that the risk is taking place, so whether it's long-term, short-term, medium-term, and also whether there are any specific tipping points that could occur. They should consider the size of the risk in proportion to other risks that are generated, and also the consistency of the methodologies used to be identifying and managing the risks. And the next step is A3, so it's additional risk mitigation and risk opportunity management. So this step of LEAP will require organisations to understand what additional mitigation and management actions should be considered. And one of the useful tools, or hopefully useful tools that we've provided during the LEAP process is a risk and opportunity register, which is again available on the website as part of the version 0.3 release. And this helps organisations to map the different types of risks to specific actions that could be undertaken and match up to different metrics that could be used across the different categories of risk. And particularly it highlights the need to consider the interconnections between nature-related risks, the climate and social risks, but also how they contribute to the underlying systemic risks that society is experiencing. So this stage of the process really is mapping it to different types of risks and understanding what can be done, which then leads us on to A4, which is the risk and opportunity materiality assessment. So we really highlight the need that measurement and prioritisation are fundamental to the management of nature-related risks and opportunities. So this stage is, once you've understood what risks are potentially out there, it's measuring the impacts of the risks, the organisations themselves, and using it to prioritise them. So we define a couple of types of metrics that can be used to do this. So exposure metrics are based on nature-related impacts and dependencies, which refer to the previous stage of LEAP, which is the evaluate phase of LEAP. And then secondly, magnitude metrics are used to assess the financial implications to the organisation of nature-related risks and opportunities, so understanding the extent of the risks themselves to the organisation. And again, on the website, we have examples of these metrics that kind of match the different examples of nature-related risks and opportunities in the different categories to show what it could look like in practice for organisations that are doing this type of evaluation. And we also have prioritisation criteria. So in order to determine which risks to prioritise, our current guidance says that it should be a function of the magnitude of the risk, so matching it back up to the magnitude metrics, the likelihood of the risk and opportunity occurring, which in best practice would be using scenario analysis, but acknowledging that may not always be possible. And then times some additional criteria, which include the size of the risk to nature itself, as well as the impact to society. And using this function would help organisations to highlight the severity or the extent of the risk and opportunity, and that can be used to rate and prioritise which risks and opportunities they would then address as a priority. So yes, that was the final slide. Just noting that then you then move on to the prepare stage where you'd actually address the risks and opportunities themselves. Yeah, I'll hand back to Emily.
Thank you, Laura. Really helpful overview of what's currently in the draft. With the emphasis, it's all draft, and because we want to be learning from pilot testing indeed. So let's now move into that real experience of trying to do this in practice, moving through the locate, evaluate, and assess phases. Can we start with you, Stephanie? And I'm looking forward to hearing your experience with pilot testing. Over to you.
Fantastic, thank you. So can we click to the next slide and the next one after that, please? Fantastic. So just before we get started, my name's Stephanie Hime and I run a consultancy called Little Blue Research, and we focus on the provision of technical support for environmental, economics and social impact valuation. We do that by helping companies look at their impacts and dependencies on nature and people, helping them with sustainability strategy and risks, and also doing some research and training. If I could get a click on the slide, please. Fantastic. So just for this group's information, we're involved, Emily already mentioned a number of different groups we're involved with, but in relation to the TNFD specifically, UK Business and Biodiversity Forum, we're involved with their TNFD working group, this forum obviously, and other areas like the BSI, where we're helping lead the comments back on the different version of the TNFD. Could I get another click on the slide, please? So the projects that we're going to draw most heavily on today was one in association with Global Balance, who are a consultancy that focus particularly on biodiversity. But the overall context for our pilot's going to draw from 3 different pilot tests that we've done across different sectors. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So the context for our pilot test specifically was to look at developing a high-level understanding of nature-related risks within one business unit, to identify the potential gaps and barriers to implementation of the TNFD framework, to set out a plan of next steps, develop a qualitative assessment model, and contribute to the pilot feedback through different mechanisms such as today. If we could go to the next slide, please. So all of the pilot types that we've been doing are considered independent pilots, and the example that we're going to talk about today looks at materials company. So in that respect, things like packaging that we've been looking at. The company location, it's a global company, but we were looking at a subset of relevant locations for a particular business unit. And the scope, in addition to that single business unit, were very specific parts of the LEAP process. So L1 to E2, and then A1, and honestly with a little bit of the risk evaluation A3 as well. And our value chain focus for today's discussion is going to focus on the supply chain, but the particular project that we looked at supply chain and own operations for our business units. We involved a number of different internal stakeholders in this pilot process, and that was procurement, sustainability, the logistics team, operations, and external suppliers, but we'll come on to what that looks like in just a moment. Can I go with the next slide, please? So why are we starting off with prioritization underpinning this assess phase and discussion? Part of it is really important because we're looking at companies, or a company with more than 20,000 suppliers. So there has to be some narrowing down, even by business units not good enough. So we started to do that by considering how much money was spent in different sectors, what the strategic importance of different suppliers might be, and also to try and understand the knowledge about the different sectors within the pilot testing company. If you can click through, please, and again, please. So those green and yellow markers on the side really show where we were able to do things and where there were some challenges. So it was straightforward to ask the internal teams at our company where they thought the most strategic suppliers were, what was important to their business process. We could also find some information about where they spent their money. The categorization of that spend was quite dependent on the things that they were buying, though. Things where there were slightly more challenges, if we grab another click on the slide, please, were the locations. So I don't think this comes as a surprise to anyone here, but the locations of suppliers currently based on invoice locations and HQs. Each supplier could have more than 100 different locations, some of which would be factories producing our inputs that were being bought by the pilot company, sometimes very small outfits with maybe 1 or 2 locations. And so what we could do is look at current CO2 emissions. Our pilot testing company had a really good handle on that as a proxy for environmental impacts. And we could also start by screening at a global level using some of the Encore data. So we had 3 particular areas that we looked at in terms of inputs. If we go to the next slide, please. So in order to try and refine this yet further, we had to look at the replacement potential for each of our key inputs and also think about whether there were any particular dependencies on the manufacture of our materials. So we're also looking at the spend context, and by that I mean, are the inputs coming into our pilot company, into our business unit, are they really a lot of the buying of an input over Europe? So as an example, is this company buying all of the product type within Europe, say of a particular chemical, or is it actually a fraction of all of that chemical that's available in Europe? So we're talking about trying to get a bit of a context to allow us to understand the scale underpinning some of the things being used by the company. If we get 2 more clicks on the slide, please. So again, what we were able to do and what we could do in conjunction with the company was have a bit of research on those key inputs. But the reason we've used the funnel picture is quite key here, because each time we're having to funnel down, because when we're getting to it more granular detail, we're going to need to look at less things. So we can't do a granular research on every single input into the production process for this company, but we can start to filter down these different elements. If you click the next. Fantastic. So again, the challenges were supplier locations and potential traceability. Anyone that has mapped a supply chain will know that going to supplier website, the data is variable, and you're not sure necessarily which locations the products you're buying from are coming from. And in that regard, we couldn't always get the context for the inputs that we were using, that our pilot company was using. So sometimes there weren't any import statistics or available industry data on the production of a particular chemical. We go to the next slide. And so what could be done? Well, we can see there from that filtering process, we have some supply locations. The pilot company has some spend context, has some impact pathways and environmental data. If you click through, please. So what we could do was an initial rating for the suppliers based on nature nature-based risk. We could try and identify particular nature-based risks. We could engage with suppliers, or at least set out the ones we'd like to engage with, and provide a series of next steps. If you could click again, please. And that allows our piloting company to then go and develop a roadmap for their own implementation, develop their own baseline and targets. If you click the next two, please. So what we were able to do for this piloting exercise were identify additional risks that weren't captured by their current process. And we were able to approach suppliers to see what data they had, how available it was, and how traceable products really were. If you can click through to the next slide, please. So going back to our risk and assessment process, what we really took away from this particular pilot was the need to build on the current risk approach. When we worked with the piloting company, we were shown and talked to the enterprise risk management team. And what we were looking at is adding additional things into that overarching process, rather than trying to come up with a new one for nature-based risks. Ultimately, this additional criteria piece was really important, because we used it as a way to include influence in the supply chain context that we were looking at here with the piloting company, and that allowed us to reprioritize some of their risks. The main risks that we saw were really in relation to transition, so potential regulatory change, but also market and operations, supply chain resilience. And finally, it allowed us to provide a summary of next steps and action. If you could click twice on the slide, please. So the outcomes of this process, though, were really to allow us to narrow down particular supplier locations. So going back to that overview that Laura gave in the start, having the risk and opportunities overall is one thing, but then working with this funneling process to sort of really target where there might be some important locations and risk was very useful. Also, by engaging with suppliers and looking at their reporting, what's publicly reported by them, we could look at their current targets on natural capital and the management of biodiversity risk. If you could go to the next slide, please. So maybe my final points are lessons learned. Integrating into that risk-based process is really important. The risk assessment process will already include a number of relevant risks. They might just need some augmentation or further details to include nature. The process was very iterative. As you can see, we prioritized once, we reprioritized, and then we reprioritized a third time, depending on where we were in the LEAP process. And then last click, please. So the supply chain lessons in particular, supply locations can be quite limited. And if you are going to engage with suppliers, it's really important that you invest in that relationship and you're not judgmental about what the suppliers are telling you. It's a learning process between two groups of people here, and we're trying to be supportive. Getting lots of data isn't necessarily the right answer. If we could get a supplier's 100 locations, but we couldn't narrow them down to the 3 that actually produce the inputs that our pilot company was buying, that's not useful. And it makes it very difficult to identify where the risk is truly occurring. So that prioritization point is very important. I think that's it from me, and I'll hand over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Some really useful and interesting insights there. And I know it's something that we have emphasized in the draft guidance, is the importance of integration into the existing risk management and assessment process. So it's great to see that that is working in practice in your pilot. and your emphasis on getting meaningful information for risk management. So really, really interesting insights. We're going to take discussion all at the end, so please save your questions and comments for Stephanie, and we will move straight into the pilot testing experience of Kirin with Yoko.
Thank you, Emily. Next slide, please. Hi, hello, good evening. Thank you for taking this opportunity. I would be happy if I could be of any help to you. Next, please. Today, I will focus on the background of why we are quick to address and respond to such a disclosure framework. I first introduced our company group, Kirin. After that, I will talk about how the disclosure frameworks have been used to enhance environmental management. We think both TCFD and TNFD frameworks can express the characteristics of a company extremely well. Finally, I will talk about our trial disclosure with leap approach. Next, please. The Kirin group had 3 domains: food and beverages, health science, and pharmaceuticals. I believe our alcohol business is well known for Japanese. For all our businesses is raw materials, our agriculture products, and water, all of which are gifts of nature. The philosophy of Aware for Life has been passed down to those in charge of brewing. We believe that our science sincere response to life has also led to our scientific approach. Next, please. Our activities of addressing biological and water resources began early on, and the impetus for a major expansion came at COP10 in Nagoya 2010. This was the start of formulating the Biological Resources Action Plan and detailed risk assessment and incentives for water resources. Next, please. In 2020, we devised our Environmental Vision 2015 with using the TCFD scenario. We were working on risk assessment and strategy for biological and water resources. So when the TCFD's final recommendations were published in 2017, we disclosed with using the frameworks within a year after the TCFD published as our 2018 environmental report. We worked to further detail the scenario analysis in 2019 and explained in the group CSV committee. CSV is creating shared value. And the CSV committee is a meeting of the top management on our Kirin group. And the committee restricts the GHG reduction targets significantly as a mitigation measures. And we would also revise our environmental vision, including adaptation measures. The TCFD scenario analysis contributed to create the new environmental vision. Based on these experiences, we have come to understand that proactive efforts regarding this TNFD initiative may also have a positive impact on our business. Next, please. For detailed results of the scenario analysis, please see the web and the environmental report. Most of our materiality are agricultural products and water, as I mentioned before. That is how important natural capture is to Kirin. Next, please. It was very significant that the TCFD enabled us to talk holistically about climate change, biological and water resources issues. We believe that environmental issues were not separate issues, and we had to be addressed in an integrated manner. Although the TCFD was wonderful, we felt a bit constrained by the fact that we could only talk from the perspective of climate change. With this background, when the TNFD was started, with its focus on praise and dependency, we felt very happy that we had found that last piece of the puzzle for killing the holistic approach to the environment. Next page, please. Based on the result of analyzing our own materiality and defending our TCFD scenario analysis, we found that LEAP approach is similar to our activities. That is what we disclosed in our environmental report 2022 on this page. The first is a Japanese wine vineyard of Chateau Melson. The second is a tea plantation in Sri Lanka. And the last is a water risk in Australia. Today, I will show you focus on the Japanese wine vineyard in this issue. Next, please. First, take a look at this photo. The right photo shows the current vineyard. The left photo shows the status before maintenance. As you can see, the left photo is a typical example of idled farmland in Japan. It has fallen into disrepair and became a habitat for unwelcomed wild animals, which are destroying the area. Next page, please. Sorry. The Marco Vineyard is a Japanese wine production area, as shown in the previous photo, and was originally idle-wild. When it comes to wine, terroir is the key. Terroir is a term that refers to the characteristics of wine, which was affected by the land and climate. We actually believe that terroir is the most appropriate word to describe the natural capital. Not only is it a matter of grabbing the name of the land, but because of this terroir, the vineyard is land-specific and dependent. This is where locate come in. Furthermore, we have studied the impact on nature of turning idle and neglected land into vineyard. This is evaluate. As an access, we find that grassland cultivation creates a diverse ecosystem and a habitat for various species. We find in total 289 plant species in Mariko Vineyard, and it includes the grassland-specific species. Next, please. Furthermore, the grassland environment in Japan has been declining year by year, and the loss of biodiversity in grassland environment has become an issue. It was found that hedge cultivation in vineyards for wine created a favorable grassland environment between the hedges. Can you see the red line? Inside the lettering, there is a grassland environment, and it is protecting grassland biodiversity. Next slide, please. We know that the vineyard contributes to grassland biodiversity. Now we are also conducting research on how ecosystems can recover from grassland, degraded land in Yamanashi Prefecture. Look at the pictures. They are for the 5 years from 2016 to 2021. As the vineyard has been created, the number of plants and butterfly species identified has increased. Butterflies are indicators of the grassland environment. Next slide, please. First, we believe that the creating of the vineyard contribute the nature positive society that were also discussed at talk 15. And applying these activities to TNFD's REAP approach makes them easier to understand. This picture is of Satoyama. Nature in Japan consists of a mosaic of rice fields, forests, rivers, and other environments in symbiosis with people's lives. In other words, it is an environment that can be protected through agriculture. Unfortunately, such an environment is diminishing in Japan due to the aging of the population and changes in the industrial structures. Our activity is a small vineyard, just only 13 hectares, but as part of the community, we nurture the natural environment and contribute to solving social issues as well. The final page, please. Disclosure in accordance with a good framework not only contribute to ESG assessment, but also ensures that advancement of environmental management. Through TNFD, we would like to further pursue an integrated and specific approach to the environment and grow as a social presence. Thank you, that's all.
Thank you very much, Yoko. That's another really, really interesting pilot test, and appreciate the emphasis on looking at things holistically in an integrated way, both nature and climate together. And we already have one question on those links between climate and nature. There is one specific question to TNFD about how to prepare a disclosure on greenhouse gas emissions. So just to clarify, in our current guidance on metrics, we refer to the TCFD framework for any disclosure of greenhouse gas emissions for scope 1, 2, and 3. So the TNFD framework is signposting to the TCFD for those disclosures. And so what we're hoping and anticipating is that there may over time become TNFD and TCFD integrated disclosures that would look at greenhouse gas emissions using the TCFD framework and other nature-related risks and opportunities using the TNFD framework. So just to be clear, we're not duplicating TCFD, but building the links in. So maybe building from that, a question for you, both Stephanie and Yoko, is in the analysis, how you thought about climate risks and nature risks, and whether any interesting insights emerged about the connections between climate and nature-related risks in your assessment.
I'm happy to have a go at that. I think what was interesting about the interlinking was a number of the climate risk had already been identified in relation to the supply chain, and the nature-based risks were actually a further augmentation, so a bit more detail associated with the relevant supply chain risks. So rather than just saying something like this supply chain might be impacted by flooding, there were other elements that were of note, such as things like closeness to a particular land type or specific region that might be of importance that weren't necessarily identified under the climate piece, but would have been identified if you'd used a more holistic approach. So it wasn't a new risk, more like an augmentation of some of the climate risks. And actually, I'm going to add on to that because I can see that, that friend James Spurgeon's asked specific material risks and opportunities and mitigations were recommended. Because this is made up of a couple of different examples, I will seek to at least try and give one or two. So transition risk with regards to regulatory changes, particularly in relation to our materials company that we talked about. Some of those mitigations or opportunity for mitigations would be things like R&D and looking at different ways of producing their materials. So it's pretty high level, but it gives you an idea of the sort of discussion we started to have for that example. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yoko, how about you in the Kirin example? Did you see any links between climate and nature-related risks, having done your TCFD disclosures previously?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Emily. And we are the food company, food and beverage companies, so the most important raw materials is agriculture. And the agriculture was the most, the climate change impact on agriculture is the biggest, I think. So we need to struggle we need to address the climate change first. So we got the SBT net zero certifications in 2022, and we have a lot to reduce the GHG emissions. And on the other hand, we need to make our adaptation plan. One of our adaptation is to support the, for example, Sri Lanka tea farm, because we know the activities in Sri Lanka since 2013. And after that, the people in Sri Lanka told us that climate has already changed. They can't get the high quality tea leaves anymore, as they said to us. So we think that the climate and agriculture has a strong connections, and we should to support both of climate change and natural resources, natural capture.
Thank you, Yoko. That makes a lot.
Okay?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, and I'm sure that through the pilot testing, we are going to learn, just like you are, that these linkages between nature and climate are many, and that actually thinking about it in an integrated way makes a lot of sense, as you have done. We have some very practical questions coming through for you both. Maybe I'll ask two questions. One is how you selected your relevant locations. How did you prioritize? Yoko, you focused in on the vineyards in Japan, but you had 3 examples. How did you pick those places and those issues? And also for yourself, Stephanie, when you were thinking through what's obviously a very complex value chain for this organization, how did you pick where to focus? So that's the first question. And then the second is, how long did it take you? Very practical question. How long did the pilot take? Which I'm sure was a function of your scoping. Maybe, who would like to go first?
I don't mind if that's all right. In terms of picking the location, I think there are a couple of things. So we use this context of spend to do it. So we didn't start by looking at location. We had to narrow down further because we had so many suppliers. So which sectors was the biggest spend? Which inputs are strategically important to the company, to the manufacturing process? Of those, is the company a really large buyer of that? In this case, it was chemicals. Is a really large buyer of that chemicals in the region that we're looking at? in some aspects, the location was narrowed down already because our business units operated in Europe. So we had already zeroed in on a slightly smaller region. But once we had identified the sector, then identified our input into production, we could then look at which suppliers they spent most money with. That then narrowed down where we would start to look at location. In terms of time, the time on our pilot project ranges depending on scopes, quite right, Emily, and that's ranged between 12 and 20 weeks.
Yoko, how about you? How did you select your focus?
Okay, the 3 years which we forecasted our materiality areas, and we know that things because of the TCFD scenario analysis. So after TCFD scenario analysis, we correct the data of 3 areas, so we can prepare the scientific data before the TNFD frameworks, and we just conducted a pilot leap disclosures with these previous data. So we need to deepen the content of the disclosure in the next year and after the several years. And we try to collect more data and related to our all supply chains with Encore and the other tools.
Very helpful, thank you. So I guess what I'm taking from both these examples is some very interesting suggestions that complement what we already have in our draft for how you would select your focus, looking at spend and the size of this is importance for your spend is an interesting suggestion I don't think we've looked at before, so lots to learn there. I'd like to turn to a question for Laura, which has come through and has been quite popular, which is about how we're drawing on the GRI biodiversity standard. GRI are one of our core knowledge partners, Laura, so could you explain how we're learning from and contributing to the draft GRI biodiversity standard, which has just gone out for consultation?
Yep, for sure. So early on in the process, we did a landscape assessment of the different biodiversity nature standards that were out there, and that fed into our thinking on the assessment metrics that we already formed. And that, of course, didn't include the updated GRI because they weren't out at that point. But as they are one of our knowledge partners, we have been continually monitoring their work and discussing and inputting into their work and vice versa. So it has fed into our thinking up to this point, but I will note that we haven't released our disclosure metrics. So up until this point, we've only released our draft assessment metrics, and we're currently forming our disclosure metrics currently. So that's including review sessions with our knowledge partners, of which GRI are one of them, and it will go into the thinking with the disclosure metrics, which the draft version will come out at the end of March.
Fantastic. Yeah, so a nice example of where we're both learning from an existing relevant standard in development as we build the framework, and also GRI drawing on what TNFD is doing as learning through our pilot testing. So looking forward to continuing to deepening that relationship over time. So let's have a look here at some other popular questions. I can see one, it's not so much a question as a comment about calculating risks in quantitative terms. Is it feasible? Question mark. It's actually framed as it's not really feasible, is it? Scenarios are not there. Financial impact calculation requires metrics like value at risk. So it'd be interesting to know, it sounded like you didn't get all the way through to risk quantification in both case studies. So it'd be interesting to know, if not, why not? And if the intention is to do that as a next step. But But while you prepare your thoughts on that, I just wanted to let those on the call know that we are running a cohort of pilot tests with asset owners to look at exactly this issue of quantification of risk, because we know it's difficult, we know it's complicated, and we know it's important. So we look forward to sharing the results of those pilot tests with you in the spring. Who would like to go first on this tricky question of quantification?
I'll give it a bash.
Thank you.
So for the pilot, you're right. We didn't necessarily quantify them in a way that was the most awesome, because of the nature of the pilot, because of the scope and the timing, really. So we were able to use the current criteria that the company had for likelihood and exposure, and then we added influence as a further criteria on top. It's not monetary quantification. What I would say is that there are tools and there are ways of doing that. My experience would point you towards a natural capital balance sheet. So using the British standard BS 8632 on natural capital accounting, that looks at quantification into the future of impacts and dependencies. That is a way you could do it. It's a technical piece of work that requires time and effort. So for a pilot, it's not really the right way to go, but it's something maybe to consider.
Thanks. Really interesting link back to the natural capital accounts work. How about you, Yoko? Do you intend to quantify risks in financial terms as part of your assessment? Oh, you're still on mute, Yoko.
Oh, thank you, Mary. It's a bit difficult question for me, and maybe we need to discuss internally about that things. And now we have some target for the natural capital, but we need to change that target because of the SBTs for nature. We participate in the SBTs for nature methodology frameworks, but I think it would be published in this year. We hope. So after checking that the new target, we should make a our roadmap and target, and there will be influence to our financial disclosures. We think so. Is it okay?
Yes, it's really helpful, and we are particularly interested to learn about pilot tests that are applying the TNFD framework and the SBTN's methods for science-based targets for nature together. So look forward to learning from you. We published some guidance with SBTN in November, signposting to their methods. So really, really great to learn from how that works in practice. So thank you both, Stephanie and Yoko, and to Laura for setting out these insights. I just wanted to close in addressing one of the questions here about the best way of sharing your findings from any pilots that you're doing. So we really welcome sharing. Please do let us know if you'd like to share your pilots in one of these piloting clinics, as Stephanie and Yoko have done. You can also provide us feedback directly via our online platform. And to provide feedback, we have 2 questionnaires, a general questionnaire and another questionnaire that's specific for our latest beta release. So please do provide us that feedback at any time. It also really helps if you can fill in the form on our online platform to classify your pilot. Once you've filled that form out, you become part of our database and we're aware that you're doing a pilot and can get in touch to learn directly from you. And that's led by our pilots program lead, Felipe Arango. So please do send us feedback via the platform. Get in touch if you'd like to be part of the piloting clinic or have a more informal discussion. We're really now in all listening mode to learn from pilots over the next 6 months as we finalize the framework. So with that, our next piloting clinic next month will continue on the assess phase, but looking at it from the perspective of financial institutions rather than corporates. So please do join us next month. And thanks again to Stephanie, Yoko, and Laura, and to all of you for attending. Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.